Welcome to this week's video on My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing episode 5 of volume 2 of Vigilantes. You know the rules and so do I. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below and you will be right at your next week's show. Whilst you're there, you should like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTube stuff that YouTube wants you to do, because YouTube is increasing this kind of place small content creators. Support your local small content creator today. It would do them a power of good, and a big thank you for helping me break into 90 subscribers. Can we go higher? It would be nice to see 95 by the end of the year. Maybe even 100. Ooh. But now we get into the review itself, and we start off as we always do by getting into the positives. But just one little note before we actually get into the positives: I wrote the negatives for this review first, so you know that might be an indicator where I'm going with this particular review. But with all that said, let's actually get into the positives and discuss the positive things here. I have to say that this episode was a fairly insightful one. It gave us a very insightful week. We get to learn more about the emotional state of a character that hasn't really been featured to any great length since they were first shown a few weeks ago. We're getting a great insight into why they are the way that they are and the kind of road they end up going down. We get a good slice of action and set up for a potentially pretty bloody awesome fight next week. That is, of course, providing they don't then drag that fight out to the next volume, but we'll soon see about that. It was great to learn more about the spiky villain. For the sake of the notes, I've written them as being spike villains, so forgive me for not getting their name right. Learning more about them was great to see. I will admit that I feel that going this heavy on a character that we haven't really seen that much of, and has been absent from the story for quite so much time, kind of makes me feel a little bit conflicted. Like, on the one hand, what we get to see about them is great, and more on that in a moment, but on the other hand, it kind of makes me feel as though this would have been a lot more impactful had they been a more of an active presence within the story up until now. Like, had they been this rival to Crawler, as I predicted they would have been in that first episode, then maybe learning a little bit more as to what makes them tick here and now would have had a little more of a weight to it. But still, that's not to say that it wasn't without any weight, as I feel that what we learnt was handled rather well. It presented a deeper dive into a character and their motivations and the way they are the way that they are. Much like with the villains that we see in the main series, this guy is less of a villain because of dogma or a desire to do evil, but just because the world at large really didn't want them. His quirk is one that can only be really used for offence. It lacks any kind of domestic flair that the others have. It is what makes him a very dangerous person to be around, and as we see in this little flashback sequence we get midway through the episode, it ended up leaving him to becoming lost and isolated. He has been treated as a wrong-un all his life, and it's all as a result of something that really has no control over. And with no other alternative to him being able to exist in this society while still being able to use his quirk, it has left him in a rather lonely state, living a very lonely life, and has left him to a point where turning to criminality, even if it's only petty criminality, is his only real option. Which is made doubly painful when you realise that you can just easily swap out quirk for behavioural difficulties or learning difficulties, and you get a lot of people out there in the real world, and people that I have known, someone who is in a state of circumstances beyond their control and having to deal with it because society as a whole just doesn't have ways to really deal with them. We see situations like this many times within the main series. I won't name who those characters are for people who have yet to see it, but I will say that I am happy to see this tradition being kept strong here, giving us villains and bad guys and even just morally grey characters whose motivations and reason for being the way that they are have a level of grounding to them. They don't need to be dark, they don't need to be gritty, they just need to be rational. They just need to be something that I could hang something on and go, right, I understand why they are the way that they are. That is very realistic. I will say that I did like the nightmare sequence that we get midway through the episode. I think that it really did tell the backstory of this character perfectly well in an incredibly efficient way. It truly sends home why they are the way that they are, and why he would want to do more trigger and to use it. For him, it's like taking a recreational drug. It gives him power and control, something that he's been lacking pretty much all of his life, certainly his life since discovering what his quirk is. Beyond all of this, we get more with Stendhal, and I think that it's fair to say that it is now confirmed that he is Stain. Like, his quirk has the same name as Stain's now, for goodness sake. Whilst we did establish a few episodes ago that it's possible for people to have the same quirk yet not be related to one another, I think that it's a bit of a stretch at this point to say that they aren't related. Though, of course, I'm still keeping a little bit of myself open-minded. Maybe it isn't him. Maybe this is just the guy that inspires Stain and makes them realise, oh, I need to kill heroes now, but we'll soon see as far as all that is concerned. What I will say, though, is that, and we're looking to a little bit more of the gratuitous side of things, I will say that I am looking forward to the fight that seems to be building for next week. Knuckle Duster versus Stendhal. An unstoppable force meets an immovable object. One skilled with weapons and the other whose body is a weapon. One that can stop the other one in their tracks with a quirk, or one that can go toe to toe with people with quirks even though he doesn't have one. Like, I think it could make for a very fascinating little matchup. I have liked seeing the action sequences in Vigilantes for the most part. Yes, I think that sometimes there's been a bit too few of them. Sometimes I think that some of them have gone a little bit on too long and just kind of lack the flair and dynamism that I think that they really need at times. But still, I'm interested to see how it all ends up going. There is a part of me, however, that does worry that that fight will end up boiling down to a repeat of the fight between Stain and the students of Class 1A from My Hero Academia. This is, of course, providing that Knuckle Duster just decides that he doesn't bleed now. I could just easily see him going, I refuse to bleed anymore. Then all of a sudden his blood starts to retract itself back into his body. Or something stupid like that. But we'll see. It could make for a very fantastic fight. There is a part of me that is worried that it will end up dragging over into the next volume, which I really don't like. Like, this makes for a great season finale-esque fight, and there's a part of me that's worried, just looking at my copy of the manga, that it might not get concluded in one episode and might get dragged out at least for one more. At least I hope that if it's dragged out for one more, because I don't think you can do anything more than that. With all that said and done, however, and regrettably so, we have to get into the negatives, and I have to just say here and now, am I the only one reading this one that kind of felt like we've missed an episode here? It really feels like that. I just genuinely feel that something's been bungled some way along the lines here. At the end of the last episode, or the episode before last, I should say, we get the scene where the spiked villain wanted to tell Crawler something. He had his "we need to talk" moment. Of course, as we see in that particular episode, Popstep doesn't want anything to do with him for obvious reasons. The spike villain then dismisses them, to which then Crawler then says, talk about what? And then the scene ends. I suppose that from that point on they just never spoke. They just wandered off and they just didn't conclude their train of thought. Because typically when you have a scene like that, when someone says, we need to talk, then the other side says, no, I don't want anything to do with you. Then the other side says something cocky like, oh, well, you'll regret it if you don't talk to me. Then the hero says, talk about what? We then cut to something else, then cut back to them, then talking about it. We never had them cutting back to them talking about it. And the thing that really pisses me off is the fact there's no indication that Crawler and Popstep left. So, in the previous episode, I was just thinking to myself, right, so we're having a little bit of a flashback now, and then when we get into next week's episode, we'll resume with them talking in this restaurant or club or whatever it is. And then we'll get a little bit of an understanding as to what this thing is that Spike Villain wants to talk to them about. But we didn't get that. Hell, when we started with this episode, when we got the little bit where he's visiting his friends in the hospital, I assumed that that was a flashback. And we suddenly get a cut to him talking to Crawler and Popstep going, yeah, well, this was the last time I saw them. Then all of a sudden, this happened. They were all murdered or something. But we didn't end up getting that. For goodness sake. Last week's episode, or again, the episode before last, the last full episode, set up for a scene where they would talk, but we didn't end up getting that. We just skipped over it. For the sake of maybe a panel or two, we could have got over that, but we don't get that. We just skip into the middle of something in such a way that it genuinely feels as though we've missed an episode. And within this particular episode, another downside is that we get another insert shot, a little caption thing that covers up a plot hole. Even though it really wasn't a plot hole. It's another little shot with the fake X-Men saying, by the way, this guy knows who this guy is because he told him. Only he didn't. We know that he knows who this guy is because he was properly introduced in the previous full episode. This confirms nothing, and it reconfirms nothing. And not only does it neither confirm nor reconfirm anything, it's factually inaccurate. He didn't introduce him to him. They met in the previous episode. Okay, sure, technically he did introduce him, but the way that it's suggested is that, oh, he just told him his name. Well, I guess he kind of did in order for them to meet, but they've met. They know who each other is. They've met more than once. He's in the first episode, for goodness sake. Why do we need this insert? We know that they've met. Was there like a 6-week break between this volume and the last one, for goodness sake? Or at least this episode and the previous one? And here's another thing that sticks out to me. Does Stendhal not know that B's handing out Trigger? Because he sees her do it. Because if he didn't know before, he knows now. She's just outed herself for what? More data that she can use for nebulous things that a handler or a master can use? But the truth of the matter is that now Stendhal knows that where these instant villains are coming from. And I know that his morality is a bit grey and him and Stain are kind of full of shit when it comes to taking down villains and such. But he know that B's behind all of this. He should be taking down her. He should at least have a scene where he's going, right, after this is done, we gotta talk. But we don't get that. He just kind of disappears after that. Well, he doesn't disappear. He starts fighting Spike, Villain, and Crawler. B's the one that disappears. Well, any kind of scene or any kind of indication that Stain or Stendhal is going to take on them next. Like, I know that I'm not a fan of Stain/Stendhal, but this whole sequence just makes them kind of seem like a bit of a petty idiot or a bully. They won't go after the big names. They won't go after the actual villains. They'll go after the small fries, the small fish, the minor villains, the minor heroes to make themselves seem like some kind of big shot. And the thing that really sticks out to me with all of this is the simple question as to why are they rushing? Like, I could understand if this was the anime and they were just really desperate to have a big end of season big final fight thing. I could understand that. I could understand them skipping over details, skipping over episodes, as we've had done in previous seasons of the main series. But we don't need that here. This is a manga. You don't need a big end of season fight, because they don't operate on seasons. Again, I could see it happening if there was an anime, but here you don't need to do that. As such, it feels like they've skipped an episode purely and simply for us to get into an action sequence, when the action sequence itself is, thus far, kind of only really mid at best. And as a result of that, we've lost a chance to have some really important context, all for the sake of an action sequence, which probably is going to end up hanging on for another couple of weeks or so. Maybe this will be better handled in the anime. I hope that it is, because at least then they can add extra couple of scenes to explain things out. Honestly, all it would have taken to really smooth these things out would be to add a little scene, or at least a couple panels, where Popstep and Crawler are leaving the restaurant rather than talking to the Spike villain at the end. Because at least then it explains why the conversation didn't happen. As I mentioned previously, the big thing that confused me about all of this is the way that that episode ended with Popstep and Crawler. Their final scene was them saying, talk about what, or whatever the exact wording of it is. And traditionally, whenever that happens in a TV show, a movie, a comic, a manga, whatever you want it to be, immediately then we end up finding what they're end up talking about, what the thing is they want to be told about. Whether that is immediately in the next scene or in the next episode. Here we don't get that. It's a subversion of the formula in a way that doesn't really benefit anybody. You could have quite easily had a thing of them saying, talk about what, and the Spike villain says, I don't want to tell you, you're a bunch of idiots, you probably don't need to know anyway. And then Popstep and Crawler, well, fine, fuck you, and they'll end up leaving. Then cut to Spike villain with a worried look on his face, like he's just kind of done something he shouldn't have done. At least then it would have covered us for it. But that is not what we ended up getting here. Which is a shame, because what we do get end up happening in the main episode itself, in the meat of this episode, is still good. But I just feel that, for the goodness sake, it should have been handled a lot better, because it just screws up the flow of this entire episode. Now, I know that some people are going to make an argument about show don't tell, but let me just make this clear. I'm not advocating for tell over show. I'm not saying that this character should have had a big monologue where they talked about their emotions and their backstory and what have you. But I will say this, is that I feel that when you are setting up to inform a character, and by extension the audience about something, then you still need to show or tell them it. You can't just skip over it like nothing happened, which is what we end up getting here. And this could have, again, been very easily overcome by just for the sake of an extra couple panels. Again, you could have easily had a panel where Pop, Step and Crawler are leaving, then cut to the Spike villain looking pissed off and regretful, with maybe some enigmatic or mysterious sentence about the situation at hand, and done. It sets up for this week perfectly. For the sake of an extra 10 seconds of footage, essentially, you could have had something that was set up for everything that we have here. But we don't get that. In fact, I went back to reread this part of the volume just to make sure that there wasn't a page or so that I was skipping over here that would have something similar to it. But we don't get that. It sets up for something that then just doesn't happen, and with no explanation as to why it didn't happen. So I'm just sat there reading this thinking that I've lost a page somewhere along the lines, which is what isn't what happened. So in the end, as we get into the overview, I have to say that regretfully, this is a very muddy episode, and despite the fact that there's some really bloody good quality stuff here, like that nightmare sequence that we get, is brilliant. Whilst I do think it could have been done better, maybe make it a double page spread, really create some truly grotesque images, that's not what we got, and what we got was good for what it was. It told us everything we needed to without telling us what we needed to know, and that's great. The problem is the fact that it's executed in a very muddled way because of the fact that there's no real context for or consequences for what happened in the last proper episode. I'm not going to go over it again because you've heard me rant about it far too much, but that's just the way to things. It could have and should have been handled better. For the sake of an extra scene or so, this could have been a lot smoother, but we didn't get that. Which means that when we come to the anime, if there's going to be one, we effectively need a little bit of filler to end up making all this flow better, which is going to make certain parts of the audience cringe by the fact I'm advocating for filler. Well, that's said and done. Speaking of the audience, let's get into Comment Corner! One comment this week, and it is a quick one, and it comes from Big X1 again, who at this point feels like they should need their own theme music by given how frequently they comment on these videos, who says, "This is the intro that Stendhal deserved," which of course referring to last week's episode, and I have to agree. Last week's episode was the moment where Stendhal really arrived on this series, and regardless of what I may think of them, their moral argument, I still think that they look cool and they do some really fantastic stuff. I think they make for a brilliant bad guy. And last week, even though I do have some issues with it, I think that is the perfect way to introduce them. I wasn't so keen on the episode before that when we had the first reveal of them, because I didn't really think it actually revealed them, just kind of showed them effectively in silhouette, then went from there. But still, last week was fantastic, and I'm curious to see how they would adapt that as an anime, but that's not for me to worry about. Anyway, thank you all for listening. I do apologise for the rant midway through. I just find it infuriating. Like, I suppose it's the kind of I'm not mad, I'm disappointed thing. Like, you get a similar kind of vibe from me when I watch certain episodes of Doctor Who, because I know that Doctor Who can be a fantastic series when it wants to be, and this series can be fantastic when it wants to be. But when it comes down to really minor stuff that professionals shouldn't be making mistakes over, it kind of really annoys me. Or maybe we'll see. We'll see how it ends up by getting executed, if it ever is executed as an anime. Still, thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye!
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!